You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 28 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode I talk to Robert Degle. Robert is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Black Belt from New York who trains under John Danaher and is also a philosophy major. So we discuss how he started in BJJ in the blue basement with Danaher, and also his start with philosophy and existentialism, and how this led to him pursuing an academic career with a focus on American pragmatism and Wittgenstein. We explore how this can influence grappling training in regards to learning, competition, and seeking the truth through using logic, paying attention, and then on top of that, the importance of persuasion. So I found this to be a really insightful chat with Robert, and as I said, he is a philosophy major, so at least one person knows what they're talking about in this discussion in regards to that. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. It's also worth noting that since we recorded this episode, Robert had been competing, and actually in one competition you may have seen he beat 꽱ᴏᴅᴏᴅᴅ in a Grappling Industries final. But in the the match before that, he actually suffered a torn ACL. So since then, he has been thinking that may have actually been his last competition. So it will be interesting to see how he goes in his road to recovery on that. So yeah, keep that in mind when you're listening to this podcast. And now let's go to the podcast. G'day, Robert. How are you, mate?
Good, very good.
I'm glad we could meet up. We've been trying for weeks or months to make this connection happen. So
yeah, you're not kidding. The different time zones make it difficult sometimes. But
yeah. But it's good to finally link up. And you're over there in New York.
Yeah.
Still crazy times happening over there.
Yeah, more or less.
But I guess, one of the benefits of living in New York when it's not in the middle of a pandemic is the ability to train with one of the best teams in the world, with John Danaher, the Danaher Death Squad, and all those training partners. So I'm wondering just, how did you get involved in Jiu-Jitsu, and how did you end up linking up with, one of the best teams in the world?
Yeah, so I first got interested in grappling, generally speaking, when I was about 14 years old. I was like really into Dragon Ball Z, and like I played like a lot of Halo and like fighting games. And I was interested at the time. I didn't really play any sports, but I was interested in learning like some self-defense. And at the same time, I very casually was watching UFC. I, at the time, barely knew the difference between like UFC and pro wrestling, but like I remember turning on one time being like, okay, this is the real one. Like, this is one where it's actually like legitimate. And I was very interested in it. And I wanted to do jiu-jitsu, but I was like 14 and like didn't really have any money. And my parents were not going to pay for it. And so I talked to one of my friends who was on the wrestling team of my middle school. And he was like, hey, you could do wrestling, and that's kind of like jiu-jitsu. And I was like, all right. And it was free. It's like a free sport in the United States. So I started with that, and I definitely liked it. Like, wrestling was good. That's probably influenced why I've always tended to favor no-gi, because I had that wrestling background. It's funny. Anyone who's ever seen me compete, I pull guard. So like they hear like I was a wrestler, they're like, what? And like, well, a lot of things actually have translated from wrestling. So for instance, like I think the biggest thing has been the hand fighting. I think that the hand fighting game that I play is very influenced by my wrestling background. My arm drags, I use the same arm drag from butterfly guard that I used to use when I was a high school wrestler. Obviously it's changed because you're standing or you're seated, but it's still the same fundamental movement. But I always had in the back of my mind, so I actually always specifically tailored my wrestling game to jiu-jitsu, because so for instance, I did this thing called, it's called leg riding. It's basically back control. Because I always was like, well, I'm just doing this because I can't afford jiu-jitsu and I want to do jiu-jitsu someday. And when my senior season of wrestling ended, the week after, I got a job in the middle of my senior wrestling season working at a pizzeria. And so now I had money. And so the week after wrestling ended, I started jiu-jitsu. And during that time I had learned, so during the time that I was wrestling, I had learned more and more actually about jiu-jitsu. So for instance, I became a really big fan of like a lot of the Japanese grapplers like Shinya Aoki and Masakazu Imanari and BJ Penn. BJ Penn was like really, he was like my favorite at the time. I still do really love watching old BJ Penn fights, you know. Like his fight with Takanori Gomi was one of the fights that like made me really want to get into jiu-jitsu. Like I really loved it. Then so I started jiu-jitsu formally. I did a little bit of jiu-jitsu this summer before my senior season of wrestling, but it wasn't like, I literally just did a couple drop-ins at Sarah's on Long Island. It wasn't anything like real. And I had messed around a little bit with rolling in the wrestling room. There were two other guys on the team that actually had done jiu-jitsu before, and watching just like jiu-jitsu on YouTube and stuff, like I knew what a triangle was. Even before I had ever done jiu-jitsu, I really liked the idea of guard. Even though I wrestled, I thought guard playing looked really interesting to me because I liked this idea of being able to win no matter where you were, top, bottom, etc. And also, I'm a very naturally lazy guy. I'm always looking for the most like efficient solution possible. I don't want to have to work hard if I don't. I will work hard if it's required to get a job done, but I would prefer to do something simpler if that's possible. And so guard pulling just seemed like, damn, why waste time going for the takedown? This is when I was wrestling. I was thinking about this. So I started doing jiu-jitsu, and I really liked it a lot. But I never thought about it as like a career. Like I was not thinking about this was just something I was very interested in, right? It wasn't like I was thinking, I had this like ingrained image in my mind that jiu-jitsu people were either professional MMA fighters or they were Brazilian. And I was like, well, I'm not Brazilian, and I didn't really want to be a pro MMA fighter. Like I thought maybe I'd want to fight a few times, but I'm not really like a person who I think would fit in a professional MMA career too well. I want to be a coach for MMA fighters in the future, and I actually may want to fight again, but I don't think that I have the personality that like, you've got to really have a competitive drive that's extremely intense. And I don't really have that. I'm more interested in learning and studying. I'm not like I am a very intense person, but not in a hyper competitive sense. Like I don't really care about necessarily being the best, so to speak, which I think you kind of need to be if you're a pro MMA fighter. I'm interested in being, this might sound like corny, but like the best I can possibly be, right? Like I'm very, very intense about that. Like I take what I do super seriously. But for me, it's not necessarily about like beating other people down, so to speak, which I kind of think you need that to be a pro MMA fighter successfully. And so I was in school at the time for philosophy. I went to college for philosophy, and my intention early on was to become an academic. Like I thought that's what I was going to do. Since I was in about 10th grade, I had started to think about becoming an academic. I started reading philosophy around the same time that I started doing wrestling, actually. It's funny in a sense, philosophy and grappling have always sort of been connected to me because I really was drawn to them around the same time. And they've always sort of been around each other in my life. But so then that was really much more my focus. But at the same time, man, I loved grappling so much. Like I would cater my course schedule around grappling, you know, maybe not, and not the best thing you should do, but like I did it. Like I remember one time I wanted to take this class that was early in the morning. It was an existentialism class. And as all young, edgy philosophy students are, I was very interested in existentialism. And, but I was like, no, it conflicts with training, so I can't make it, you know? And I started competing pretty early on after I started training, like 6 months after I got into jiu-jitsu. And I did well early on. Like I won much more than I lost, and I enjoyed it a lot. And I basically, I started to wonder, okay, where else could I go to get better training? Because the people I was training with were good, but I didn't feel like I was getting pushed at a certain point. And so at the time, I was much more gi-oriented, actually. And my one of my good friends was a black belt under Vitor Shaolin, and Shaolin owns an academy in New York City, on 8th Avenue, not too far from Henzo's actually. And I started going there because again, I was much more gi oriented at the time. And I really loved it there. It was a very, very good academy to train at and develop my skills. So I was doing a lot of gi tournaments there. And this was while I was doing my undergraduate degree. And then there came a point though where I started to get really attracted to the no-gi game. And I began asking around, okay, where can I especially leg locks. Like I was watching a lot of Masakazu Imanari. I had seen him before, but specifically there was one fight in one championship, Masakazu Imanari versus Kevin Bellingham, which is it was an amazing fight. And I watched it early in the morning, and I was just like, damn, like this is, I really liked, what I liked about it was I was always very submission oriented. I wasn't really playing for points. I don't even necessarily know why. I just always had the mindset of trying to get the submission. And in the beginning, it was always upper body submissions. You know, I would get to the back, get a bow and arrow strangle, or from the front, go for triangles, arm bars. That was really my game. Very, very obviously conventional jiu-jitsu game, right? But when people stood up on me, I'd be like, what's there to attack now? Their upper bodies, it's out of range. And so then, you look for sweeps and stuff, but I wanted a submission there. And then when I saw Imanari going after the legs like that, I was like, damn, yes, that's what I've been looking for. And I started dabbling with that at Shaolin's, but it's not super heel hook heavy there. And basically I asked around, where can I go to learn this leg lock game in the New York area? And people mentioned New Zealand John to me. Like, New Zealand John. And I was like, all right. This was like right on the cusp of when the squad started to blow up. Like I came to Henzo's right before or right after Gary Tonin won his first EBI. And I want to also mention, I left Challenge on very good terms. Like he completely understood. He's like, this is not my game. If that's something you want to learn, there are other places to go. So it was a very like amicable split. Like I'm still friends with a lot of those guys at Challenge. Like sometimes when people leave gyms, there's like drama or beef. Zero in this case, fortunately. Yeah. So I switched over to Henzo's, and very different vibe from Shaolin's. Shaolin's is a smaller academy. There's not quite as many people, and I had a lot of friends at Shaolin's. At Henzo's, at first, I had no friends. For about a year, I would say, I was kind of sort of like just in the background, just doing my own thing, trying to study what the guys were doing my best to imitate it. And I'm watching them around this time blow up, doing really well. And so I was like, damn, this was the right choice coming here. Like these guys are doing super well. And then ultimately what happened was maybe about a year and a half at my being at Henzo's, one day Danaher pulled me aside and he said he had been watching me roll, and he asked me what my name was, how old I was, if I had competitive aspirations. And I was like, yeah, no, I definitely do. I had been competing pretty much this whole time, mostly by myself. I had wound up making some friends, thankfully, finally. And as you always do at any academy. And I had been competing a lot. And so he asked me if I had competitive aspirations. And I remember I told him, I'm competing tomorrow. So yes. And he liked that. And then he asked me, like, are you studying anything? Are you in school? Do you work? I told him I was a philosophy student. I was about to finish my undergraduate degree around this time. And he liked that, as you would expect. And he started coaching me around this time. And it was like a night and day shift. Like overnight, I went from being some random dude in the basement to he was coaching me. And it was a surreal shift. Like it was like crazy. I was like, damn, this is awesome. Now I'm finally getting coached by Danaher. For so long, I had felt like I was completely on my own in the basement. And you've got to understand, from the perspective of Danaher, like I didn't even blame him necessarily, because we're talking like there's like 60 to 70 guys in the room at any given time. So, I mean, like, it's hard for him to coach people. But I think what he saw in me was somebody who was very dedicated. I was there. I would almost not sleep because I was working. I was going to school full time, and I was training like a lot. So I was round the clock. I was he didn't see the school or the work, obviously, but he saw that I was at the academy very consistently. I was there for his morning and his afternoon classes almost every day. Sometimes I don't remember exactly what my schedule was, but sometimes I would have to go to class or something. But like, I was very, very consistent. I was always there for every morning class, maybe not every afternoon, but every morning class I was there. So he saw that, and he saw that I was doing well in the room. I was holding my own with guys who were fucking good. So yeah, and yeah, that's basically the story of how he became my coach. And yeah, it's been a very, very life-changing experience to be coached by him. Yeah, to say the least.
And so then when you're kind of making it in that room, I guess it's probably similar to a situation where you kind of describe, you turn up at a new place training, you don't have any friends, and it takes a time to kind of ingratiate yourself in the culture, and people realize that you're not just here for a week or two, and
right.
And I'm sure that's probably even worse in New York, where there'd be tourists all the time coming in for a week, and you got to kind of stick around before people will bother to learn your name.
Right.
So did you feel that kind of acceptance, reach that certain point? Was there, a welcoming into that inner circle once that Danaher, tapped you on the shoulder and said, "Hey,
yeah,
who are you?"
Well, it's funny because like one of my training partners, Damian Anderson, who's a very talented student under Gary Tonin and John Danaher, said to me, he's like, "Yeah, I didn't even know you trained here before then." People didn't even know who I was because there's just so many people in that room. I joke around with people like Renzo's is the most New York academy ever. Like nobody gives a shit about you until you're like part of the team, so to speak, right? Like in a sense, like, so like, and it's not even like a malicious thing. Like in New York, right, there's that common stereotype of like, "Hey, I'm walking here," right? Like you're stupid, right? And it's like, it's born out of the fact that New Yorkers we're constantly doing stuff. We're always on the move, we're always doing stuff. And at Renzo's, like, it's very much like that. Everyone is there to get better. They're very serious. They're trying to acquire as much skill and knowledge as they can. And there's a limited amount of time that they're able to train, right? Most of the people that are there are not full-time grapplers either, right? So like, it's a very like, almost like when I first came, it was almost an unwelcoming environment. But what made it so enticing was the reality is this: if you want to get good, this is a place where you can do it. It's in a sense, it's an opportunity, and that's always how I saw it. I remember standing in the lobby once after training, maybe like my 4th month training there, and I was like exhausted, and I was just thinking like, I'm getting fucked up more than I've ever gotten fucked up. And I thought to myself, I would be crazy if I want to be good, I would be crazy to leave. Like, even though I was like this, I remember going back to my apartment with my girlfriend and like complaining, like, I'm getting my fucking ass kicked every day. But like I was like, this is such a strong training environment. Like, and if you want to be good, that is a place that will undeniably push you to be good. It's a place where you have to be very self-motivated because there's so many people there. The coaches aren't really able to, even now, the truth of it is the vast majority of my development is born out of my own research. Danaher is an unbelievably useful aid in my growth, right? He's pushed me in certain directions that have been very, very important, right? But it still is mostly coming from my own research. And that's true for everyone on the team because like even with the competitors, he's still got like 15 to 20 of us. Like, you know what I mean? How could he be on top of all of us? That doesn't even make any sense, right? There's not enough time in his day, right? So you've got to be self-motivated. And I think that's important really for anyone in jiu-jitsu, right? Like if I find a student who's self-motivated, that to me is one of the best things I could ever find, because now not only am I going to be putting information into him, on top of that, he's also going to be putting in a lot of his own work to acquire information. So it's a great thing to have in a student. And it's something I always had from day one, because I was just very, very I was very curious. Like I really wanted to see how far grappling could go. I wanted to push this as far as I could go. And again, I want to reiterate, it was always with the mindset of like, this was just a very serious hobby. Like I was not trying to make a career out of it. I thought the idea of making a career out of it was kind of ludicrous. Even when there was one point when Danaher and I were talking, and he asked me if I wanted to have a career in martial arts, and I was like, not really. I was like, I'm applying to PhD programs. I think that's. I was like, at the time, what I was thinking about doing was getting my PhD, and I think this is kind of ridiculous in hindsight, but teaching jiu-jitsu on the side. I don't think I would have had the time to do that, but that's what my thought process was, where I love jiu-jitsu and I wanted to teach it, but I was like, I don't really want to make a career out of it, because I was like, at the time I really, really wanted to go into academia. But there were a number of things which pushed me away from that. And I decided jiu-jitsu was ultimately the better course to take. And I think given my situation, I think that I made undeniably, for me, the right choice.
Yeah. Okay. I think, doing a PhD and just doing a bit of jiu-jitsu on the side would probably be a big load to handle.
Yeah.
Before we get into the academic side of things with you, I am interested just to go back into the wrestling side of things, just because I have wondered how much like the folk style wrestling and college wrestling has kind of influenced John Danaher's system. Because from an outside looking in, the more I think about it, it looks like it's influenced it a lot.
Yeah.
Like, the strong front headlock game. It just seems like that there's just being in that New York area that it's probably just filtered into that system. Is that what would you think of that?
I think it would be very accurate to describe Danaher as being extremely influenced by wrestling. I think when I talk to him about wrestling, he tends to be more interested in international wrestling. So I was speaking to him fairly recently about one of his favorite wrestlers, who also happens to be one of mine, 꽱ᴏᴜᴜᴜᴜ, Ukrainian guy. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, but like he is, Danaher brought him up, and he actually happens to be one of my favorite wrestlers. And I think he's an unbelievably talented guy. Gold medalist from, I think he got it in Australia, actually. Was it 2003 was the year?
2000.
2000? Okay, yeah, back quite a while ago, obviously now. But so he tends to bring up the international style of wrestlers more frequently when I speak to him or when I hear him speaking. But he definitely has knowledge about folk style wrestling. One time we had like a guy who was, I think, like a D1 All-American or something. I didn't know who he was. And Danaher told us, he said, hey, you guys should get a takedown round with this guy if you can, because he's very talented. And he told us, do not heel hook this guy. just out of respect for him. He's like, hey, look, this guy's got a stellar career in wrestling going forward. We don't want to potentially impair that. Like, you could get him. He doesn't have the knowledge. There's no point in doing that. I wound up not rolling with him anyway, so it didn't matter. I was getting ready for a sub-only tournament, so I was like, I don't want to work takedowns. I do like takedowns, but I was like, this is not the time and place for it. I think it is definitely very influenced by it. And I'll say that this is one of the things I've learned from Danaher, that I think it sounds so obvious when you say it out loud, but I think at times people don't do this enough. One of the best ways you can improve in any area is you break down that area into different skills. You subdivide the things you're going to need to learn into different skills. And then you say, who is the best at each of these individual skills? That may not necessarily be people within the actual field that you're operating, right? So for instance, Danaher, insofar as takedowns is concerned, and there's a whole area of grappling that, quite frankly, wrestlers do better than us. That's their only focus, right? The standing portion of the match is the majority of what they do. So he's much more influenced by like wrestlers in that area than he would be for jiu-jitsu guys, right? And I think when you're studying grappling, I think sometimes when people study grappling, they focus too much on our own sport, which is good. I think the majority of our focus should be on our own sport, because that's what we're doing. But at the same time, if I want to learn how to do a double leg takedown, or just how to learn grappling in general, standing grappling in general, your best bet, I think, is to study who's the best in the world at that specific thing. And so you can look at that sport, because those guys have taken it much farther than we ever have, you know? And then you've got to modify it because things are different. They wear shoes. We don't. Their stance is lower than ours. Ours is taller. The takedown criteria in ADCC is very different than in international wrestling. So you've got to modify things, but it still is true that they have taken this skill much farther than we ever have. And so we would be, I think, making a mistake if we didn't study them. So yeah, Danaher is someone who he's very, when you speak to him, it's pretty clear, or even if you listen to him, it's very clear that there's an emphasis on honestly studying who's the best at, and taking that statement, who's the best, very seriously, because like in the sense of like looking at specific skills, right? Because just saying who's the best, generally speaking, is kind of vague. It doesn't really help you, right? But you say, okay, who's the best at this specific thing? Okay, I'm going to watch how they're doing it, ask what kind of modifications I can make, and then try to adjust it for the specific requirements of what I'm trying to do. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. That, in fact, seems like a very logical thing to do, seems like a very pragmatic thing to do. And I think that can lead us into your academic studies, which I do believe was, philosophy, and you were interested in pragmatism, and yeah, wondering how you feel that informed your study of grappling, or how it still informs it, or what benefits you think you can transfer from those two disciplines.
Yeah, so I'll start with actually why I decided not to go into academia.
Yeah.
I'll talk about like what some of my philosophical interests were and still are. Okay, so early on in my studies as an undergraduate, people told me again and again, if you're going to go get a PhD, if you're going to try to become an academic, the only reason you should ever do it is because it's the only thing that will ever make you happy. Okay, people were like, because it's very hard to be a successful academic, especially in something like philosophy. Okay, and I took that pretty seriously, and I had a lot of like thoughts about it, and I really came to the conclusion that yes, this is what would make me happiest in life. And the reason for that is because fundamentally, what I really like is I like spending long periods of time engaged in uninterrupted research. Like I just like studying stuff at length, because I'm a very, very curious person. So I can't help myself when I look at stuff, and I'm just so naturally curious. I want to know all the minute details I can about something. And the best way to do that is to just spend long periods of time uninterrupted engaging in research. So I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to go into academia for this reason. And so I basically one of the big problems with philosophy is that it's not really a fully merit-based field, because the truth is, I can make very strong points, but you can just like shrug it off, be like, I don't agree, right? Like one of my favorite philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of his quote of his, which I really like, was he said, "At the end of reason comes persuasion." So what he's saying is that there comes a point where you can make all the strongest arguments in the world, but this is somewhat complicated, but it comes down ultimately to whether someone is convinced or not, right? And in something like jiu-jitsu, or in a hard scientific field, you can just point to the evidence, and whatever it implies, and you can't really argue with it that much. You can maybe argue a little bit with it, but it's much harder to argue with that than it would be in philosophy, for instance, where, man, you can spend all day like sort of like dancing around topics and playing games with words, and people in philosophy, yeah, I think oftentimes like to do that. So anyway, so I emailed, actually, it's funny, Danaher suggested this. Danaher, I was talking to him about getting into better PhD programs, and he was like, what you should do is you should email professors that you're interested in studying under, and just talk to them about like what the program is like, because obviously he was somebody who had gone through the same process. So I emailed professors that I wanted to work with, who I respected their thought, and they all responded to me, and basically they all echoed the same thing. They're like, if you want to be a Wittgenstein scholar, you have to write about other things at first, because Wittgenstein is not currently popular in academia. There are specific reasons why he's not popular in academia. He's not popular in academia right now, and so you'll have to write about other things to get published in journals, to get tenure, and then someday down the line when you get tenure, then you can write about Wittgenstein. And I was like, okay, then why am I doing this? Like, that's not what I want to do, right? Like, I was like, the whole point of this was that I was very curious about this topic, and I wanted to dive deep on it. If I'm not doing that, what's the point of this? And so I came to the conclusion that I'd rather just do jiu-jitsu, and I think I came to the same conclusion that Danaher made, that I can just do. Danaher once made a Facebook comment about this topic, which somebody asked him the same question we're talking about now, and you know, it's like, you don't have to be engaged in philosophical academia to be engaged with philosophy, right? Like, this is something he said, and I think I thought about it a lot too. I don't have to become an academic to be interested in philosophy on a very serious level. On one level, I do feel disappointed that I never got to. I was really looking forward to becoming a professor of philosophy, and like, I really like the topic, or I should say the field, right? But I do think that my interest in philosophy, like what I find interesting about it, is very different than what I think a lot of academics find interesting about it. So I'll talk now about like my actual philosophical interests now.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so basically, I read Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus for the first time when I was I think I was 16. I found it in a local library, and I read it, and I was like, this is so fucking confusing, but I was very interested by it because it's very systematic, very organized work where everything logically follows from the last. And I loved the organization of it. I thought it was very persuasive in its arguments. And I liked how it was also very unpretentious. The Tractatus, some people might argue with that. Some people might say it's pretentious, but like the Tractatus is like, ultimately he concludes the book by saying there's some things we simply cannot understand. They're outside of human comprehension. And he says, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. That's the end of the book. That's the last thing he writes in the book. So if you can't speak about it, you have to remain silent. So I really liked that humility to it as well. Near the end of the book, he brings up this analogy of a ladder, and it's subsequently been referred to as a Wittgenstein's ladder. So a Wittgenstein's ladder is an educational tool, and I think that there are really deep ramifications for this in psychology and in therapy. A lot of people have called Wittgenstein a philosophical therapist. Wittgenstein himself described himself as a disciple of Freud. For years, I was like, what the fuck does that mean? Why would he say he was a disciple of Freud? And I was like, it didn't make no sense to me. But now I really started to understand it. And anyway, so this is what a Wittgenstein's ladder is. I'll give a jiu-jitsu Wittgenstein's ladder. Okay, so when we are first coaching white belts and we're teaching them back control, one of the first things we tell them is do not cross your legs when you have someone's back. Now, any higher level practitioner will tell you we cross our legs all the fucking time. We make body triangles. We trap arms by crossing our feet. We do it all the time. But we tell white belts not to do it because the amount of there's a sense in which you've got to go through a process of understanding where if you do it too early, you do it like an idiot and you're going to fuck yourself up and it's not going to work. So you tell them initially, sort of like a white lie. You tell them, oh, don't do this, right? Then down the line, it starts to become the case that they have acquired sufficient body understanding, sufficient knowledge that now they can actually cross their legs and you can tell them how to cross their legs. And so Wittgenstein thought that was also true for human life. So frequently Wittgenstein was all about bullshit and pointing out bullshit. When people are talking and they're just speaking bullshit, he was all about pointing that out. Right. And what a lot of philosophers didn't like about him was Wittgenstein was really shitting all over other philosophers where he's like, this is bullshit. You can't substantiate this. There's no basis for this. And but what he said once, which is very interesting, he said, so he concluded at the end of the Tractatus that all of philosophy is nonsense. So people are like, what? Doesn't that mean the Tractatus itself is nonsense? And he actually says, yes. And later on in his career, he wrote, he said, don't be afraid of talking nonsense, but for heaven's sake, pay attention to your nonsense. So what he's saying is, it's okay for us to talk nonsense, but we have to always proactively be examining it, in the sense that, so yes, it is true that I'm telling a white belt you shouldn't cross your legs, but you can do that down the line, right? But I'm doing that in a very deliberate fashion as a coach, with the ambition of guiding this white belt to a deeper level of understanding by initially lying to them. And that can get very dicey, because then it becomes like, imagine that in terms of political areas, right? Who gets to say that, who gets to know what, right? So it's there's we have to put a lot of careful thought into this, right? I'm specifically talking about this in terms of psychology and therapy. So I was very interested in this concept of a Wittgenstein's ladder, and this idea of sort of like layered understanding as it related to what I consider to be like the big problem of human life, which is suffering and the awareness that we have of the inadequacy of being, right? We're always confronted with problems. A problem is an inadequacy, right? We're confronted by something which is not the way we'd like it to be. And I'm very interested fundamentally in problem solving, which is what I think Wittgenstein was all about. This idea of, Wittgenstein always talked about resolving problems, he wanted to evaporate problems. Sometimes there are problems which we should not try to get through, but rather around, was his way of wording it. And what I think is interesting is that's also how I look at jiu-jitsu. There are times when, imagine if my only goal is to leg lock somebody. I fell into this trap early in my career. I think a lot of leg lockers do, where sometimes I do still fall into it. But we just look for the leg lock. We just look for the heel hook. I keep elevating the guy and I keep going after his legs. He keeps defensively responding in a way that kind of shuts off the leg lock options. But if he does that, he opens himself for other things. But I just don't take those other doors, right? So whereas you should be taking those other doors, that's a way of, rather than getting through a problem, going around the problem. And this has Wittgenstein was very concerned with this in terms of Wittgenstein's family had a lot of suicide. He had a big family. I think 3 of his brothers committed suicide. He himself was constantly pestered by thoughts of suicide. And I think one of my early initial philosophical impulses was the fact that when I was young, I think like a lot of nerdy bookish kids, I was very depressed all the time. And I was like, I was asking questions like, what is the purpose of life? And anyway, so the point that I'm getting at is, what I am describing here is not what most philosophical academics find appealing about philosophy. And I'm not trying to put a judgment on that. Most philosophical academics see philosophy more as a puzzle. It's like a fun puzzle. It's like a game they play with their minds, trying to create arguments. But for me, it's I don't find most of these arguments compelling. And I think Wittgenstein and other philosophers, for instance, such as the American pragmatists, provide basically Wittgenstein's barely a philosopher in a sense. Really what he is he's more of a lot of people call him an anti-philosopher or a philosophical therapist, almost more of a psychologist. I actually think I may have been more happy if I had gone into psychology and worked towards becoming a therapist. I think one of the things I'm most interested in is this idea of how we can take someone from a certain point. So there's an amazing quote in the Tractatus where he says, I'm paraphrasing, this is a bad butchering, but he said, why? So he says, imagine somebody who's depressed, and then they go through a period of experiencing certain things, which lead them into a sense of feeling contented about life and feeling very centered or grounded in reality, right? They're focused more on their environment rather than their own internal predicament. And then when they come out of that internal predicament, they then are unable to say what constituted the sense of their internal predicament. So you're depressed, just as an analogy, let's say you're really depressed, maybe your girlfriend breaks up with you and you're you fucking lose your job, like, you know, your apartment's you're about to be unable to pay rent, right? Oh man, everything's going wrong for you.
It's a tough year.
Yeah, it's bad. You go to the Jiu-Jitsu Academy and you have like 7 rounds, and when you're rolling, all you can think about is the Jiu-Jitsu, and you come out on the other end and you're just so tired, and you've gone through all this work, and now all you can think about is just your mind is clear. And so Wittgenstein is very interested in how can we take people through that process to achieve mental clarity. And that's really what I was always very interested in. And I was also very interested in the puzzle solving aspect of philosophy. So for instance, I personally don't find much of Indian or Islamic philosophy especially personally compelling, but there was one point when I was applying to PhD programs where I was making like mock curriculum for like hypothetical classes I would have to teach and such, just for fun. And I always felt very strongly that the way philosophy was taught in Western academia, at least in my college, I went to the City University of New York. I thought it was too Eurocentric. Like, I think that there are really 3 great philosophical traditions which ought to be taught to students. They're the Chinese and the East Asian philosophical tradition, the South Asian, so like mainly Indian philosophical tradition, and then the Western philosophical tradition, which I think the Western philosophical tradition ought to be subdivided between the European, the Islamic, and the American, because the Islamic philosophical tradition it's derived from the Greeks, just like the European tradition has been. So I think it would be accurate to really put it in that category as well. So I'm very interested in all these things, not in terms of like my own specific philosophical views and interests, but just as because I said I'm very curious. Like, I want to know what people have thought, you know what I mean? And I want to be able to accurately convey that to students, like teach that to students. Because maybe what I find interesting is not what they're going to find interesting. I don't want to like be a dictator about that, right? So, yeah, but like I said, like I was like, what's the point of going? Like, also this is if you're going to be an academic, and you have to accept that you're going to be teaching probably in the middle of nowhere, because jobs are very hard to get. So I was like, okay, why am I going to go to like the middle of, like, no offense, Mississippi or something, and like someplace I don't necessarily want to be. No offense to people from Mississippi.
Shout out Mississippi. We love you.
We love you, Mississippi. But like, I'm from New York, right? Like, I have a specific place I like, an environment that I like. So I'd rather be in a place like that as much as possible. And, you know, go there and then not get to write about what I wanted to. You know, it was like, fuck this. Like, I'm just gonna fucking teach jiu-jitsu instead. So yeah, that was what pushed me into it. And I still feel very much as if that process, like what I was mainly interested in, I'm very fortunate, I think, in that I think you can accomplish it through jiu-jitsu. That like process of guiding a student from beginner to master. I don't think I'm a master. I think I'm very far from it, but I want to get there, and then I want to spend the rest of my life refining my approach to coaching others to attaining that level of mastery. And I'm very interested in that, and how that can, we can talk about this later on if you're interested.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in how attaining mastery in jiu-jitsu can offer you the opportunity to become a better person. It doesn't make you a better person, but it offers you the opportunity to become a better person. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing I've kind of realized myself, is that it's possible to go into jiu-jitsu with the intent of being humble and leave the ego at the door and all that, but it's not necessarily a guarantee.
Right,
if someone's not looking for it. Like, it does get sold often as like the douchebag filter or things like that, but if someone isn't really looking for that, they can always find ways to get around it. Like, it was a crank, not a choke. I really got out of that. If there's always an excuse to skate away from being, from getting that benefit to it. So that is interesting that you mentioned, even going into the academic field, that it was like you still had to kind of play the game of, appeasing the man in the corporate structure. even just with your, what someone would think of as being just a pursuit of, pleasure, of academic pleasure, of, I just want to research what I find interesting. But even then, there was always going to be someone at the as a gatekeeper, kind of telling you the best way to go about things. And I guess that brings it back to something that you mentioned right at the start, which is that it was logic. I think it was saying like logic is secondary to persuasiveness, or persuasiveness comes at the end of logic.
Yeah. At the end of reason comes persuasion.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Which is something that I think is huge, because like I've come to understand that a bit more recently, in that like the best ideas don't necessarily rise to the top, unfortunately. Like, the best musicians don't become the most popular, the best event, the best artists, the best anything don't necessarily become the most popular, well-known, or well-respected. Those positions are generally held for the most persuasive, most persuasive people, or the most influential people.
Right.
And I think I do wonder if that's been amplified in today's world, where there's just so much information out there. And just so much, it's not like there's just a few things battling it out. There's just so much stuff out there that it really is only that persuasiveness that a lot of things people can decide with. And then to bring it into the martial arts realm, like in the old school styles of martial arts, especially like with Danaher, say, for instance, before he put that leg lock, the leg lock DVDs were out there, where it was that secret knowledge that he had. It was all those confined secrets, and it really was. And taking it back to the old school martial arts, where you had to ingratiate yourself within the community before people would be willing to give you all that knowledge, because with the Wittgenstein's ladder is like, you don't know, I can't just give you the end of it now, because you're not going to truly appreciate the struggle and how to use this, and you're not going to be able to properly grasp that knowledge. And so with the martial arts, do you think there's been some follow over with that now, just with so much information out there, instructionals coming out everywhere, that it's just, is it going to be, an overall, like, will it be that overall benefit, or will there just be that, that persuasiveness kind of battling it out?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I personally consider the internet to be the greatest invention in the history of humanity. And I would rank the second as the Gutenberg printing press. Obviously this is like kind of an arbitrary ranking, but like, you know what I mean? Like,
that's reasonable.
Yeah. And my reason behind it is, I think one of the most powerful things in the world is information access. And the degree to which any individual is able to access information relevant to what he wants to do with his time, right? So now, as information increases, as there's more information, right, what happens is there's more bullshit, right? That's natural. So what I would say is, in the modern world, you have more opportunity to learn than you ever had before. But this goes back to Wittgenstein again, but you have to pay attention to what you're doing, right? It requires more personal responsibility. And it's interesting, you brought up this, I wanted to comment before on what you said about the best doesn't always rise to the top. And I want to talk about that in two areas, because one of the things I really love about something like jiu-jitsu is that to me, the ideal of it is that we can create a situation where it is a true meritocracy, where the best does rise to the top. But you have to be careful about that, because jiu-jitsu, just as with everything else, is deeply political, so like, let's not
points to what counts as an advantage in some competitions.
Right. Yeah. Let's not kid ourselves. But But so like, I think so. I am an American and I love my country, but at the same time, I think one of the deep sort of self-deceptions we as Americans love to tell ourselves, we love this idea that merit will always rise to the top, right? How often have you heard Americans be like, let's argue about everything. The marketplace of ideas will weed out the good from bad ideas. Yeah, but that's not really true though, because like the truth is like, if I'm a very convincing, if I'm a con man and I'm very convincing about how I frame my arguments, it's entirely possible for me to win you over to my way of thinking, even though my way of thinking is like complete and total bullshit, right? So like, it's not necessarily the case that the best ideas are going to just like consider, for instance, the widespread adoption of like flat earth beliefs. You know what I mean? And like, I don't buy the idea. So a lot of people shrug it off. Well, a lot of people shrug it off by saying, oh, they're just idiots. I don't think it's not like, so what you're saying when you say they're idiots is that they're just like, they have cognitive limitations or something. I don't buy this idea that they're like, I personally think most people are generally intelligent enough to hold reasonable opinions. It's simply that they have not found the more reasonable opinions persuasive enough. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case, right? I'm not going to speculate too much on flat earth because I don't really know, right? To me, obviously, it doesn't strike me as very convincing, but I'm sure to some people, of course it is, for whatever reason. But like the point is like, you can't rely on just ideas being better, so to speak. You've got to, this is something I think that you got to think about. You got to think about, first of all, how are you framing the idea? Because it has to be framed in such a way that is persuasive. And then also like the general strength of the argument itself actually is important, but like you're making a mistake, I think, if you don't think about how you're framing the argument, right? This is something I think a lot of academics, a lot of academically minded people make this mistake. I made the same mistake when I was younger, where I was like, if the idea is right, like who fucking cares? Like, I was very interested in just pursuing, truth as much as is possible, right? So, but so like with jiu-jitsu, I think, so, okay, one of the things I find so attractive about a game like jiu-jitsu, okay, is this idea that it's difficult to argue against the validity of something in an honest way, right? You can argue against it, but like in an honest way. If I'm capable of demonstrating the mechanical power of a lock, you can't really earnestly argue against that, right? And if I demonstrate again and again the tactical plausibility of the use of that lock in actual live competition, what else do you even say? You can keep denying its effectiveness, but it's not going to get you anywhere. And in fact, it'll help me because I'm going to get you with it, right? So, and now the trouble is, there's a couple of things, but I would say the biggest problems are, the number one biggest problem is the widespread lack of a unified rule set. So there's just like too many rule sets, and that's, it's not that like a bunch of rule sets is inherently bad, but what it does is it creates a situation where people train in very different ways. And so none of us are really like, if we had hypothetically one rule set that we all practiced, right? Now, what would that rule set be, right? That's a big question. I'm not going to answer that, but let's just say, what if we only had one rule set? What would happen is it would be much more the case that we would all be playing the same game, and therefore, hypothetically, at least, we could imagine a situation where merit was more honestly tracked, because like there would be less situations where someone would just challenge the validity of a certain technique or strategy, because like, so for instance, okay, like if I'm like if I spent all my time in gi training, right, and I never touch heel hooks, I might be naturally inclined to think leg locks are just like stupid bullshit that I shouldn't waste my time on, because it's never going to come up in my rule set, right? And so therefore I shrug it off. I say, oh, it doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. So it's almost like we're playing too many different games where there's not enough centralized focus for us to really create a situation where like the best techniques, so to speak, rise to the top. It's almost like we have a bunch of different situations where different best techniques rise to the top, and then we try to cross those techniques, and it doesn't work, right? Like the best strategy in EBI rules and the best strategy in IBJJF are not going to be the same thing, but then someone tries to like cross that, and it doesn't work. It doesn't translate directly. And I have no issue with people who prefer one rule set over another. It doesn't make any difference to me. I'm just saying that it can create the problem of people not seeing that, okay, this works really well here, but when you try to bring it over here, it doesn't really work. And then also they'll try to sell it that way. Like if you say, oh, okay, no, actually, no, it does work really good here, guys. Come to my seminar, pay me money, right? Like, stuff like that. And then the second thing is there's like a deep political element to like sometimes how points are scored, how, we see this in certain tournaments. Even worse, I think, would be who gets on super fight cards, right? Like, I have a hard time. I compete mostly in open tournaments because to me, that's where true skill is demonstrated. Because the truth is, if I want to get on Polaris, that requires them booking a spot for me. Well, they haven't done that yet, and I can't make them. I would like to be on shows like that, but if they're not going to book me, they're not going to book me. I go out there and I have done very well for myself competitively. I've beaten guys that are ranked in the top 15. I've beaten 2 guys that are ranked in the top 15. I've beaten many other good people too. But if they don't want to give me the spots, if on some super fight card, they want to book two 20-pound blue belts that are going to fall on top of each other for 10 minutes, and that's more exciting to people, I can't do anything about it.
That's where you got to persuade them. You got to persuade them to get you on.
Yeah, fair enough. So to me, it's like I'm much more interested in my main competitive goals almost exclusively center around ADCC. Like I don't really, everything else to me is practice for ADCC. Like to me, that's like, because like I'm not even really that interested in competition from a personal perspective. I'm just doing it. I like competition from a research perspective. It gives me the opportunity to test my ideas in the most intense laboratory, so to speak, that one could imagine, right? Like training is good, and I love training. It's my favorite thing. But sometimes you should be able to get real looks from your training partners. But sometimes there's a level of intensity in competition that really pushes something, and you can really see how valid it is. So I think competition is very, very important. But there's a very deep political element in jiu-jitsu sometimes with who gets the opportunities on the big cards, right? But what's beautiful, what's wonderful is we have things such as the ADCC trials, such as the IBJJF Worlds, etc., right? Big tournaments where it's not about nepotism or whoever somebody is friends with the promoter. If you fucking win the qualifying events, you get to go. That's it. And then you have your guys like Dylan Dennis that are getting invites that maybe are debatably shouldn't be given, but like, it's like, but as long as the qualifying aspect is still there, I don't see an issue with it, right? Because the real meritocracy is there's still an element of meritocracy maintained there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that does make sense, and it's something that I have always enjoyed about the sport as well, especially when you're saying, the ability to test ideas in the laboratory is it is such a pure thing where you can, come up with an idea for a technique, be talking with someone on the mats, do you think this is going to work? They say yes. Or, I say yes, they say no. And you go, okay, let's spend 20 minutes now testing it out and see what we come up with. And you can, on the spot, you can kind of start gathering data and finding out the truth of the matter, which is so rare to be able to do in almost any other field where you could just, talk bullshit back and forth all day,
right? Yeah,
about who's right and who's wrong, but you can actually kind of, all right, let's go, let's test it right here, right now.
Yeah,
and there is an element of, I think, beauty to that, just that's refreshing in this world full of so much bullshit, 100%. To be able to kind of cut through it, and just at least with this one thing, this silly sport of choking people, we can at least do it with this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's what it is one of the most addicting aspects of jiu-jitsu is actually that lack of ambiguity. It provides so much clarity to us, because like the greater the degree of ambiguity in a life, I think the more chaos and anxiety there's naturally going to be. And the greater the degree to which you can evaporate that ambiguity, the more you can focus on situations where ambiguity is lessened, and you have human beings, we naturally crave purpose. Our minds crave direction and purpose, right? We want what we do to have a reason, right? We want, when we do something, we want there to be like a reason for it to be the case that we did that, right? Even on a subconscious level. So jiu-jitsu provides that in a very like clear way. And I think that, like, more than anything else, is like the most addictive part of it. You know, and I think honestly, that's like, when I think back to what I was looking for in philosophy, my philosophical interests, jiu-jitsu almost is like very like interwoven with that. You know, like I was talking before when I was talking about philosophy about, like, I'll have to give a little background for this. I'm much more interested in the idea of problem solving from a philosophical perspective than I am in the search for truth from a philosophical perspective. Okay. So there's a division in Western philosophy between what we can call like the Platonic model, and I'm going to call this the Wittgensteinian model, right? You could call it like the postmodern model. A lot of people who are listening to this that have heard postmodernism before, they don't know what postmodernism is. Like I actually think Jordan Peterson is a fairly sharp character. I think what he says, when he talks about psychology, he's very, very insightful. But when he talks about postmodernism, I want to be like, Jordan, you could so easily be characterized as a postmodernist based on what you're saying, you know. But anyway, I won't get into that. But like this sort of what we can call like a Wittgensteinian, more pragmatic philosophical worldview. Okay, what Plato was mainly after was this idea of like truth with a capital T. So, which is to say, like, okay, so he wanted to do things such as like identify what is the essence of something like a chair. So what is the single unifying essence to which all chairs adhere? Okay, that there's an assumption embedded in that there is such a thing. And what Wittgenstein and a lot of other later philosophers came to view was that that's not actually the case, that there is something that unifies all chairs, except for the fact that we call them chairs. So what this comes down to is, it's not about finding something in the world which all chairs adhere to, but rather it comes down to asking, how do we use chairs? And that is what makes a chair, use. So Wittgenstein wrote that the meaning of a word is its use in language. And what this does is, it's not about finding the truth in the world. It's about problem solving. So it's about identifying problems, because there are some things that we are outside of what we can reasonably speak about, right? And Wittgenstein wants, as much as is possible, for us to concern ourselves with things to which we can speak about in an intelligent and unambiguous way. The more ambiguous what you have to say about something, like some fields, like let's imagine I tried to have a conversation about, let's say, art. I wanted to objectively argue that one film was better than another. That is I don't even think that's something you can do. It's a very difficult thing to do. You can provide arguments for it, but ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to persuade me, right? With varying degrees of ambiguity. Now, take that same sort of a debate, and now we have that about a sports situation, such as, are heel hooks viable at a high level? Now we can look at data, we can look at trends, we can look at performances in top competitions. It's much easier to make. I'm not saying it's something that's as simple as saying, it's not like right away we can know. We have to do research and analysis, but there's a greater degree of clarity we can reach on the topic, because there's less ambiguity, because there are more clear measuring standards we can establish for identifying what we want in this area, right? What we want to know in this area. So that's like that worldview, that idea of concerning ourselves primarily with problem solving, is something that, like, so for instance, the American pragmatists generally adhere to this sort of worldview. And it, to me, is a much more like humble and I think powerful way to look at things, because the truth is like, there are certain things I think that we're better off recognizing. I really don't know. I'll never really know. And if we concern ourselves with things that we can actually work towards, for instance, such as, like, you know, if I ask myself all day, what is the fundamental metaphysical state of my existence, right? Like, it's like, well, you know, good luck with that question, buddy. Like, I don't think you're going to come to that answer anytime soon. But if we concern ourselves with such things as, I'm not a biologist, but let's say I wanted to research the, biology of a certain sort of animal or something, or if I wanted to spend all my time focused on jiu-jitsu, which I actually do, right? That's what I actually do, right? These are areas where there's much more clear measuring standards, which we can test. We can take our data and we can run it through these or measure it against these standards and say, what does the data imply? And then from there, we can come to conclusions. And because there's less ambiguity, the process of doing that, man, it's a very therapeutic one, I think, in a sense. And I mentioned this again before. It offers you the opportunity to become a better person. And if you want, I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. Do you want me to go on about that? Okay.
Yeah. No, please go on about becoming, using that to become a better person, because I'll be interested in hearing that. And just something that's come up for me. You might know more about it. There's a concept, I think it's from Plato, of the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Okay.
And it's, as he said, what is good? Well, that's tricky. That's tricky to define. What is true? That's even trickier. Right. But what is beautiful? Well, that's easy to know. You know what beauty is, right?
Yeah.
And so I've found that is another way to kind of clear up some of that ambiguity, even when it's not like problem solving, is just like looking towards that thing of beauty. Well, like, no sub time limit match to the that's a beautiful thing,
That's a spicy
no time
meatball.
limit sub only match,
Right.
So I want to maybe we'll come back to that, but maybe just the idea that with jiu-jitsu and being a fight sport, there is this idea that that there's something more primal underneath it, of like to the death, we're battling, it's instinctual, that could possibly make it hard to find the perfect rule set. But maybe let's come back to that maybe, and we can go
for sure.
How you think we can use it to become a better person.
So what I think is it gives us the opportunity to become a better person. It doesn't make us a better person. So when I think of what makes a good person, I think one of the fundamental prerequisites for being a good person is like not feeling like shit all the time. Like, think about, for instance, how I'm just gonna sound like a joke, but I'm being serious. Think about how Yoda describes the paths of the dark side. I don't know the exact path memorized, but he says something like anger leads to or hate leads to anger leads to suffering leads to pain leads to the dark side, or something like that, right? It's all about this idea in which, like, if we feel constantly dissatisfied about our lives, when you're like pissed off, are you more likely to be a dickhead, or are you more likely to be a nice person? You're more likely to be a dickhead, right? Crime rates increase in situations of greater poverty, right? So it's easier to be a good person when you feel good about your environment, you feel happy about your life, you feel everything is working in its order as it should be, and everything's going well for you. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be a good person. You could have everything. You just look at politics. Yeah, like, you could be super rich and have everything you'd want. Well, that's just financial. But like, I think like if you're a centered, well-balanced individual and you feel like confident about your life and you don't feel stressed out and anxious all the time, it's easier to be a good person. I'm not saying it doesn't force you to be a good person, but it provides you the opportunity to be a good person, right? And so what jiu-jitsu, I think, can do, this is an idea Jordan Peterson actually talks about. I agree with him very much on. When we're strong, both maybe mentally, to a lesser degree physically, but maybe a little bit physically, when we have like strength, right, especially internal strength, it's easier to help others, right? And I think about how jiu-jitsu can bring you to that through a process of self-development, and it offers you the opportunity to refine yourself and to grow. And it's a never-ending, I was thinking about this today, it's a never-ending series of problems, which could be viewed as kind of existentially terrifying. In one way, it's never going to end, right? But in other ways, beautiful, because it means you will never not have the opportunity to grow. And if you're not growing, I think you're dying. And as much as is possible, I want to be growing for the rest of my life. And I want to, I think this isn't for everybody, but for me, I want as much as possible to be helping others to go through the same process. I think to me, that's the next step in the journey. Right. And, yeah, so that's, I don't know if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I really
okay, good.
I really liked hearing that, because it does offer that opportunity. And I like what you said about, the never-ending problem could definitely be seen as an existential nightmare.
Right.
It's definitely something that's hooked me into, to keep coming back to it over and over again, and to stay in there, because, and it doesn't make sense maybe logically that I'm never going to be able to solve it. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to, it's never going to be finished, but that's actually what drives me to keep coming back to it and makes me enjoy it.
So wait, let me just cut in real quick, because I actually just thought of something. Yeah. This is actually funny. I never thought of this before. I think what separates jiu-jitsu in terms of, so if we imagine a situation with a never-ending problem, okay, what separates, we can imagine two sorts of never-ending problems. One which brings about existential dread and is in that sense kind of terrifying, and one which brings about a sense of like joy at the capacity you might have to solve these problems, and you're glad that you get to engage in such a situation. I think what separates it more than anything else is ambiguity. If I feel constantly as if the problems that I'm solving are very ambiguous and vague, that will bring about existential dread. I don't know if you're familiar with Albert Camus, the
myth of Sisyphus.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So he was actually one of the first philosophers I ever read. Him and Friedrich Nietzsche when I think I was 14. Terrible first two to start with. Very depressing. But like, especially Nietzsche. But like Camus talks
what's
about
the first line of that Camus book? Is it's like you must decide in the morning if you want to have a cup of coffee or kill yourself or something.
Right. Yeah. Jeez. So that book, so the myth of Sisyphus, the first line of the myth of Sisyphus is the only truly serious philosophical problem is suicide. I read that when I was 14. And I was like, oh boy, what the fuck is this? My mom went to a school where she took a lot of philosophy courses, and they were around my house. So that's why, that's how I first started reading them. And I read that. And like, so the myth of Sisyphus, this idea is that life can be filled with this existential dread over the fear of constantly having to be working to solve problems that have no clear purpose and give you no direction with your actions. That is scary. If you look at life or existence as being this never-ending series of pointless things that are, imagine you're constantly exerting effort and energy in a pointless way. That's terrifying. That's very scary. And I think what some people do, they shy away from that and they go, oh, okay, I'll retreat into hedonism, which is just a pursuit of pleasure, right? That was when I was younger, when I was like 14. That was my first philosophical conclusion. I was like, well, I guess physical pleasure is all there is. And like, but it wasn't compelling to me when I really thought about it. Because I was like, that's sort of like a drug. And you can never have enough of a drug. And really, it doesn't solve the problem. It just puts it at bay. A real solution to the problem is if we can take the situation where ambiguity exists and therefore your actions are pointless, but somehow structure your life in such a way that creates a sense of purpose for your actions, where the problems are now it's not like terrifying, but it's an opportunity to do something which has meaning and purpose. And that's all about reducing ambiguity and increasing like specificity of what having a specific goal or things you're moving towards. And in like a grand universal sense, you could just say to me, well, Rob, it's still all pointless. And that's fine. But what's beautiful about it is in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. When you're in the middle of a role, imagine you're in the middle of a role. It's impossible to both be present in the role and also be thinking to yourself, life has no meaning. If you're not thinking about the guy that's trying to fuck you up in front of you, you're gonna get fucked up. And you said, I actually think something you said is very connected to this. You brought up the primal element of it, right? it's almost like our instincts take over. We're like, we got to fight back, And so that kind of helps us to, it's almost in a sense, it helps us to shut the fuck up and stop thinking about things so much. Like, last thing I'll say about Wittgenstein, I promise I'll try to stop talking about it.
It's fine. I've been enjoying it.
Okay, good. So I saw this thing at a philosophy forum once, which I really, really loved. I thought it was so funny and so true. It was a picture by a little kid. There was a little kid. There was like a guy on top of a hill. There was a sun, a tree. It looked really pretty. And somebody wrote the caption. They said, "This is Wittgenstein in a nutshell." And on the picture, it just said, "The world is beautiful. Shut up and look at it." And that's Wittgenstein in a nutshell. Where his whole idea is we need to stop worrying about things. We've got to stop worrying about things we don't have control over and that we can't fix. You want as much as possible to structure your life where ambiguity is reduced, and you can appreciate the beauty in the small things, so to speak. But anyway, getting off topic, but this conversation now is actually, I hadn't really ever drawn that division before, and I think it's a good one.
Yeah, no, I like it. I mean, I've been enjoying where it's been going for sure.
I'm glad.
And yeah, I mean, I like that, just clearing up that ambiguity and that jiu-jitsu offering that vehicle to at least something in life, be able to work through it and kind of chip away at it. And I know that idea of, you have to imagine that Sisyphus pushing that rock up the hill as being happy and enjoying it, right? He's having a good time doing it. And
could be. I always imagine that would be really boring, but yeah.
And yeah, so maybe we could finish up just with that idea about there being something more, of more primal to jiu-jitsu or fighting, or, maybe that constant question of is jiu-jitsu, is jiu-jitsu a fight or not. And because I do think it is, that relates to there not being a clear rule set within the sport.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely bizarre for any sport to not have a single identifiable rule set. Pretty much every sport does. And yet this one, it's still not even clear what the best rule set is.
Yeah.
Points, no points, sub only, time limits, EBI rounds. There's so many variations. And I think it's got to be something to do with that idea of there is that deeper meaning if someone taps you or chokes you out, that it means more than if they, dunked on you or scored a goal. And then people only want that to happen in the purest, expression of combat, shall we say.
Yeah.
And there's that constant battle with that is, why do you think that is, is that a constant interplay going on?
I'm not sure. It's really tricky. I think that you are right about, you're onto something when it comes to there's something more like, it can feel more personally damaging when you submit in a jiu-jitsu match than maybe if you get dunked on in basketball. I actually have some views on that about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think as much as possible, I want to remove my personal, my sense of self from a jiu-jitsu match. I don't think you should, if you get tapped or you lose, you shouldn't be thinking of it as you got tapped or you lost. I think a better way to frame it as there was a failure in my understanding. I wasn't capable of expressing technique in the way that I ought to be. That's something you can proactively fix rather than if I just say, "Oh, I suck." Okay, well, where does that take you?
Your way of looking at it seems like a better competitive mindset as well.
Yeah. I think it's healthier ultimately, and I also think it leads to jiu-jitsu being something more fulfilling in your life. I don't like the idea of jiu-jitsu just being ego fulfillment. Oh, look how fucking cool I am, bro. I just fucking tap somebody out. I'm so sick, right? Like I really personally dislike that. But I think so. But it is hard though not to have ego in jiu-jitsu, and I think ultimately it's kind of impossible to completely remove that, right? There is a sense in which when you Like you go out there, you hit like a nice submission, you're like, fuck, man, that was sick. Like, you know,
you got to enjoy it a little bit.
Yeah. Like, and like, it's okay. So I think it's okay to fully enjoy it. It's like, I think what you want to be careful about is this idea that, bro, I'm sick as fuck because I hit that. No, this is going to sound very like hippie maybe. A better way to think of it is like, I don't think you should think about jiu-jitsu as being expressed by you, but rather through you. Okay? Good jiu-jitsu to me is something that channels through you. Ultimately, if something works, it's not because you're fucking the most fantastic person ever. It's because the jiu-jitsu was powerful. And that's what we're all looking for. But again, it's hard to have that mindset, I think. And I think that oftentimes in competitive settings, people are thinking about such things as, do I want to look like shit? Do I want to get my ass kicked? No. So they kind of sometimes will veer towards rule sets they prefer. Anyone is guilty of this, right? Like, I don't compete in the gi. I don't compete in the gi because personally I think it's a different sport. I think if I was going to do that, I would need to prepare in a very different way than I am now. But I could hear someone being like, bro, you know, he should be competing in the gi too then, right? Okay, fair enough. I can't really argue with that, I guess. But like, I just think that, I guess it seems to me it comes down to like, there is an element of ego protection because it can be more ego damaging than other sports. And so as a result, there is more ego protection. So maybe that's why more rule sets, like I kind of think more rule sets are born out of, well, if you didn't do this, I would fuck you up. Or if you didn't do that, I would fuck you up, right? They just keep trying to change things. I think that what we should do, what I would like to be the case, I don't expect this to happen. What I would like to be the case is as a community, sort of there was a conversation about what are we trying to do in jiu-jitsu? What is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do? And I think that, to me, the ideal way to look at it is as jiu-jitsu is the art and science of control leading to the application of submission. Okay, if that's the goal, which I think a lot of people would agree with that, if we establish that as the goal, then I think the next question we ought to ask ourselves is, what sort of a rule set can we construct which pushes things in this direction? And we can challenge rule sets and say, to what extent does this rule set encourage that? Right? And I don't think people have done that enough. I don't think people think about this enough. I think they just kind of go like a lot of people just sort of like end with things like, does it simulate a fight? Well, we have MMA for that. I don't think we need jiu-jitsu to simulate a fight, right? Like, I just think that, you know, we ought to be, if this is about the art and science of control leading to the application of submission, if that's all it is, we need to look at the various rule sets and assess which are most capable of doing that and sort of narrow down into the best rule sets. But again, I don't think that's going to happen because of what we've talked about, like maybe ego protection and things like that. But so the way I look at it as a competitor is that, from my personal perspective, I love jiu-jitsu, period. I love the practice of jiu-jitsu, and that includes both positional and submission-based skills. I want as much as possible to grow in my understanding of jiu-jitsu, and that's going to be done on a mechanical level, also on a tactical level, and also on the level of the developing meta. So the different strategies people employ in different rule sets. So I want to understand in terms of all three of these dimensions. I'm much more personally interested in the mechanical and the tactical level, but you've got to also pay attention to the meta. That's important. And I'm just, you know, I put less emphasis on the meta though, because like I think that it can distract me from like what I actually like about jiu-jitsu, which is like, so like Marcelo Garcia lost in the finals of the ADCC trials in 2003 in Sao Paulo, Brazil, before his big breakout performance, because in the finals he pulled guard, okay? And then he went on to get an invite because Dennis Hallman didn't show up to the weigh-ins, and Marcelo happened to be the second place guy in the city they were holding the tournament in, so they're like, oh, invite him. So he did the tournament, and then he had a spectacular performance where he won. Now the question is, was Marcelo worse than Daniel Moraes, who beat him in the ADCC trials finals? I don't want to think of it in terms of worse or better. I just think that the jiu-jitsu that Marcelo expressed ultimately in that tournament was very beautiful and is something worth pursuing as a practitioner of the art. he did lose in the trials finals, right? So in that sense, he didn't really do very well in that match. But I think I just like don't care about that. I care about, like, when I watch something like what Marcelo did in that tournament, it's beautiful. And I want to be capable of, as much as possible, doing stuff like that. So it's not that I'm ignoring rule sets. It's just that they're not the chief priority to me. I have this fantasy in my head someday of making the ADCC finals and pulling guard right away. You know, I'd like to do that. I think you got fucking, what is it, 30 minutes in the finals? Like, you fucking have, come on, man. You can't tap someone in 30 minutes. You weren't meant to win that match. So, yeah, I'd like to get there someday and have that happen. I don't know if my rant makes any sense or I sound like a fucking idiot.
No, I get you, because I feel the same way too when, like, it happened in the UFC the other week where Sean O'Malley, like, got injured in the middle of a fight. I don't know if you saw, but
I did, yeah.
And then, but pretty much then, you know, the discussion gets filled afterwards with, oh, was it a real win? Was it a fluke? What happened? You know, should it count? All that stuff. And, you know, my perspective is, look, it happened. That's it. It's like, there's no point arguing about it now. You can, you know, observe what went on and pay attention to it and note down what happened. But, you know, the rules is the rules, and it goes down in the record book as a win or a loss. And I think that's kind of what you're saying with the, you know, with Marcelo Garcia. It's like, it's just the technique's there. We no matter what happens on the scoreboard, we can always find that beauty within the technique that's going to be that's going to have lasting value beyond any you know, result of the competition set. Yeah,
and what I'm saying is that did the match accurately demonstrate to us who was the better grappler, right? Or in that fight, it's kind of a weird case because I don't think you should take anything away from the guy who beat Sean O'Malley. That's not fair to him. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying you are, right? Like, the guy got injured and the guy took the opportunity just as he was supposed to, right?
That can happen. That's it.
Yeah, I'll never begrudge a competitor for doing what they have to do to win. Sometimes I watch matches and I'm like, oh my God, this is painful to watch because someone's really gaming the system. But I'll never begrudge a competitor because, like, that's what I would do in that situation. If you're trying to win, you know, you ought to be, as much as is possible, operating within the rule set, right? You're an idiot if you don't, right? Even though that kind of contradicts what I just said about wanting to pull guard. So maybe I'm an idiot.
It's got to be persuasive and win over some fans too.
Yeah. I guess so. Yeah. And I guess I'll close off with this because this is kind of like a funny way to end it. So I just said, like, I guess I'm kind of an idiot, right? Like, well, you know, I think sometimes when I look at my own life and I think about, like, how I've gone about doing things, sometimes when I talk to people about my jiu-jitsu, I have a very sort of conservative, safe style of jiu-jitsu. I like to minimize risks. I'm very calculated about risk taking. But when I think about my actual life, I have done such dumb shit. Like, you know, like, pursuing a jiu-jitsu career is honestly very stupid. Like, and I would not recommend it to most people. But, like, you know, I did it because I really wanted to. And so maybe that makes me an idiot. But I'm an idiot who's glad that he did what he did.
Well, I guess there's nothing wrong with being a happy idiot.
There you go.
That's been a great talk, Robert.
Thanks, man.
I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, I mean, even again, to finish off on, you know, what's more persuasive, I mean, my favorite rule set at the moment is probably quintet, which probably doesn't meet any of that criteria of real jiu-jitsu at all, but I like it.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So I know you've got your own online, you know, academies kind of set up, and if people want to get in touch with you, what's the, you know, how can they go about it, and what is that you've got online for offering them?
Yeah, so best thing to do would be follow me on Instagram at Robert Degle BJJ. That's Robert Degle BJJ, and you can also add me on Facebook. But I'm definitely more active on Instagram. In addition, you could subscribe to me on YouTube. I been much more active on YouTube recently. I really like the format because you can have longer technique videos. So that's the same thing. Robert Degle, BJJ, Robert Degle, BJJ. I put like free techniques and stuff on there and on Instagram all the time. And I have a website where I sell instructional content. For instance, I have one on the 꽌ᴏ movement, which is like the leg scissors. I have one coming out on leg lock defense and guard retention that's dropping September 12th. And then I have one on modern arm lock and heel hook offense coming out October 3rd. That's on Robert Degle, spelled the same way, bjjonline.com. So yeah, those would be the sources to check out. And in addition, I am at some point moving to Singapore to start teaching at Evolve MMA, whenever. We'll see. But
who knows? 2020.
Hopefully. I'm definitely going at some point. It's just a matter of when. You know, it's the waiting game, and I could be going earlier, but I'm actually waiting a little bit longer so that I can do the trials here in the US. I'm hoping to go right after the trials are done. So
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. And of course, it's also Roddy is Dank on Reddit, which we didn't get into the meaning of that name, but maybe we can come back and have another chat.
Sure, yeah, I'm down for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Cover some other ground because I've really enjoyed this.
Thanks, man. Yeah, likewise.
It's beautiful. So you have a great day, and we'll be in touch.
All right, sounds good, man.
Thanks, Robert.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.